At the end of the 19th century, the United States was undergoing a period of profound change. Large cities were growing at an unprecedented rate, attracting crowds from all walks of life, driven by the hope of a better life. Chicago, in particular, embodied this rapidly expanding America. In 1893, the city hosted the World's Fair, a colossal event that attracted millions of visitors from around the world. Amidst this constant hustle and bustle, one building attracted little attention. Local residents simply called it the Castle. Yet a few years later, this building would become infamous around the world for its association with the man the press would portray as America's first serial killer. This man's name was H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett. He was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, into a modest family of American pioneers. His childhood was marked by a violent, alcoholic father and a devout Methodist mother. Growing up, he was bullied and harassed at school because of his intellectual abilities. An experience recounted later in his memoirs indicates that during his childhood, classmates forced him to see and touch a human skeleton at a local doctor's office. The children initially took him there to scare him, but Mudgett was fascinated instead. He would later refer to this episode as a formative experience. He later enrolled in college and attended the University of Michigan's medical school. However, he did not simply obtain a standard degree. He forged a medical degree so that he could practice medicine. During his years of study, Holmes became familiar with dissection and anatomy. He was involved in shady activities, including stealing corpses from laboratories. He disfigured them and then claimed that the people had been killed accidentally in order to collect money from insurance policies he had taken out on each of the deceased. After graduating, he adopted the name Dr. Henry Howard Holmes and moved to Chicago around 1886. H. Holmes was born. Charismatic, cultured, and capable of inspiring confidence, he embarked on a well-established criminal career. Insurance scams, fraud, and selling stolen corpses to medical schools. He had many complex personal relationships, including several simultaneous marriages and multiple identities. The Murder Castle. One of the most famous elements associated with Holmes is his building in Chicago, nicknamed by the press as the Murder Castle. Located in the Englewood neighborhood, this three-story building was constructed gradually beginning in 1887. Holmes first set up a pharmacy there, purchased through fraudulent means, then expanded the structure to add apartments, and finally what he presented as a future hotel for the 1893 World's Fair. Over time, and especially under the influence of the sensationalist press, this place was depicted as a murder castle, filled with windowless rooms, secret passages, traps, deadly gas chambers, soundproof rooms, a crematorium in the basement, and various forms of torture. These horrific stories had a profound impact on the collective imagination. But historical investigations show that these descriptions are extremely exaggerated. Many of the macabre elements described by the press have no reliable material evidence, and there are no contemporary documents authenticating complex systems of torture or death. The so-called secret rooms were often storage spaces for goods purchased on credit that Holmes had no intention of paying for. It is interesting to note, however, that during the construction of the building, Holmes personally supervised every stage of the work. He regularly changed architects and workers so that none of them ever had a complete overview of the entire project. This approach allowed him to maintain total control over the design. The result was a building with a strange architecture and a confusing, almost labyrinthine layout. A structure that, in a sense, seemed to reflect Holmes's own personality. But contrary to what some legends would later claim, the building was not a perfectly designed and organized killing machine. However, it was around this place and the man who built it that the myth of the man who would come to be known as America's first serial killer gradually emerged. Crimes and disappearances, what we really know. For years, the press portrayed H. Holmes as a killer who had claimed dozens, even hundreds of victims. But when we look at court records and the work of modern historians, the reality is quite different. Holmes was not a mass murderer who killed at random. His victims were almost always people close to him, associates, employees, companions, or people involved in his frauds. He did not hunt. He exploited the people who trusted him. The best documented case, and the one that would lead directly to his conviction, is that of Benjamin Pitezel, a carpenter and occasional con artist who worked with Holmes on insurance scams. Holmes convinced Pitezel to take out a large life insurance policy, promising to fake his death in a staged accident in order to collect the money and share it with him. But in 1894 in Philadelphia, Holmes actually killed Pitezel and made his death look like an accident. After that, Holmes took charge of 3 of Pitezel's children, Howard, Alice, and Nellie. For several weeks, he traveled with them across the United States and Canada, before killing them one by one. These 3 murders were formally established by the police investigation. It was these murders that turned the case from a simple fraud case into a multiple murder case. At this stage, there are already 4 confirmed victims: Benjamin Pitezel, Howard Pitezel, Alice Pitezel, Nellie Pitezel. Other probable victims. Other disappearances are strongly linked to Holmes, although not all of them have been established with the same level of legal certainty. Julia Smythe, an employee and mistress of Holmes, who disappeared with her daughter Pearl in 1891. Emmeline Sigrand, another employee, who disappeared shortly after working for him. The circumstances, witness statements, and Holmes' lies make his involvement in these cases highly probable, even if direct evidence is lacking. How many victims were there, really? After his arrest, Holmes claimed to have killed 27 people. At other times, he suggested even more. But investigations show that several people he claims to have killed are in fact still alive. Others died of natural causes, and his accounts are full of contradictions. The press at the time, eager for sensationalism, reported more than 200 victims. These figures are now considered completely fanciful. Historians now estimate that the number of confirmed victims is at least 4. The number of probable victims is around 8 to 10. Beyond that, we are entering the realm of speculation. The modus operandi. What characterizes Holmes is not frenzy. It is calculation. He almost always kills for money, insurance, inheritance, to eliminate an inconvenient accomplice, to make a problem disappear. There is no uncontrolled impulse. Murder is a calculated utilitarian decision. Confessions. One last lie. In prison, Holmes wrote and dictated several versions of his confessions. They are all different. He changed the victims, the locations, and the methods. Today, historians consider these confessions to be psychologically interesting, but historically unreliable. Even after his arrest, Holmes continues to do what he has always done: manipulate the narrative. H. Holmes is not the killer of hundreds of victims described by legend. He is a murderous con artist who killed a limited but real number of people, almost always in his circle, for money or personal gain. Psychocriminology. To understand H. Holmes, it is not enough to know about his crimes. We must try to understand how he functioned. And here, an important clarification is necessary. We cannot make a formal medical diagnosis about a man who has been dead for over a century. What we can do, however, is analyze his behavior in light of modern psychology. When we look at what we know about Holmes, a number of traits emerge with remarkable consistency. First, lying. Holmes lies all the time. He lies about his identity, his past, his skills, his relationships, and even his own crimes. And it's not occasional or defensive lying, it's a way of functioning. Then there is manipulation. Holmes does not live with others, he uses them. His wives, associates, victims, accomplices, and even journalists become tools. They are used to obtain money, social security, or to solve a problem. This type of behavior closely matches what modern psychiatry calls antisocial personality disorder, described in the DSM-5-TR. It is a persistent pattern of disregard for rules, deception, exploitation of others, and lack of remorse. And behaviorally, Holmes checks almost all the boxes. But that's not all. Holmes also strikingly matches what clinicians such as Hervey Cleckley and Robert Hare have described as psychopathy. Psychopathy is not an official diagnosis, but a well-studied clinical profile. It includes superficial charm, pathological lying, egocentricity, lack of empathy, and cold use of others as objects. Holmes presents precisely this mask of normality. He projects the image of a cultured, respectable, professional man. But behind this facade, there is no real attachment, no guilt, no remorse. Even when he talks about death, including that of children, his tone remains cold, distant, almost administrative. Added to this is another central trait: narcissism. Holmes has an obvious need to feel superior, special, above others. He wants to control how people talk about him. This is exactly what we see in his contradictory confessions and in the memoirs he writes in prison. He is not really trying to tell the truth. He is trying to stage his persona. Some psychiatrists, such as Otto Kernberg, refer to this type of case as malignant narcissism, a mixture of narcissism, antisocial behavior, and aggression. It is a particularly dangerous personality type because it combines a need for domination, a lack of empathy, and the ability to manipulate. Another fundamental point is that Holmes is not an impulsive criminal. He does not kill in fits of rage. He plans, he anticipates, he calculates. In behavioral criminology, we would refer to him as an organized profile. His crimes are structured, thoughtful, and almost always linked to a specific goal. And that goal is rarely emotional. For Holmes, murder is not an uncontrollable impulse. It is a tool. It is used to obtain money, to eliminate an accomplice who's become dangerous, or to make a problem disappear. This is what is known as instrumental violence. Violence used as a means, not as an emotional expression. Even after his arrest, Holmes continues to lie, manipulate, and construct narratives. His memoirs, known as Holmes's Own Story, are very revealing, not because they tell the truth, but because they show his obsessive need to control the narrative, to remain interesting, and to never appear as an ordinary man. All of this paints a very coherent psychological portrait. In modern terms, we would probably say that Holmes had a severe antisocial personality disorder with marked psychopathic traits and significant pathological narcissism. He was not a man carried away by his emotions. He was not a chaotic madman. He was a cold, strategic social predator, perfectly capable of imitating normality. And that is precisely what makes him so dangerous. Because people like him don't look like monsters. They look, on the surface, like anyone else. Where does it come from? When drawing up a psychological profile of H. Holmes, one question naturally arises. Where does this type of personality come from? Are people born this way, or do they become this way? Modern psychology generally answers, a little of both. Current research shows that serious antisocial behavior almost always results from an interaction between individual predispositions and the environment. People are not born killers, but they may be born with certain traits that, in the wrong context, will develop in a dangerous direction. In Holmes's case, historical sources refer to a childhood marked by a violent and alcoholic father, a rigid family environment, and early humiliating or distressing experiences. This type of environment is now well known to increase the risk of developing antisocial personality disorders. From a developmental psychology perspective, in order to develop empathy and moral boundaries, children need relatively secure attachments and consistent adult role models. When these reference points are unstable, violent, or unpredictable, children can learn at a very early age that relationships are power struggles rather than bonds of trust. Learning theories, and particularly those of Albert Bandura, show that we learn a great deal through observation and imitation. If a child grows up in an environment where violence, domination, or deception are normal means of getting what one wants, they are more likely to internalize these strategies as acceptable tools. Added to this is conditioning. When problematic behavior leads to an advantage, avoiding punishment, earning money, gaining control, and is not punished, it tends to reinforce itself. In Holmes's case, his early lies, scams, and manipulations seem to have worked. He got what he wanted. He was not arrested. Psychologically, this is a very powerful mechanism. The brain learns that deceiving, manipulating, and exploiting are effective strategies. They gradually become automatic. Modern research also shows that some people exhibit low emotional sensitivity from childhood, with low reactivity to fear and distress signals from others. This does not condemn someone to becoming a criminal, but in an unfavorable environment, it can prevent the normal development of empathy and guilt. In Holmes's case, we see an early fascination with death and corpses, and an apparent lack of disgust or fear in the face of things that disturb most people. This kind of early desensitization can contribute to trivializing the suffering of others. Little by little, if we put together a dysfunctional family environment, early humiliating or violent experiences, low emotional sensitivity, and antisocial behaviors that work and are reinforced, we get fertile ground for the development of a predatory personality. This is not an automatic fate. Many people grow up in difficult circumstances without becoming criminals. But in some individuals, this particular combination of factors can lead to what modern psychology calls an antisocial developmental trajectory. Conclusion. The story of H. Holmes reminds us of one essential thing. Killers are not born in a vacuum. They do not appear as inexplicable monsters. They are slowly constructed at the intersection of certain personal traits and an environment that reinforces the worst strategies rather than curbing them. Holmes is not the killer of hundreds of victims that legend would have us believe, but he may be something even more disturbing. A cold, calculating, perfectly integrated social predator who used intelligence, lies, and manipulation as others use force. What makes his case so important is not only what he did, but how he was able to do it for so long without being caught. He did not live on the margins of society. He lived at its heart, using its flaws, its rules, and the trust of others as tools. His story also shows that this type of personality is not formed overnight. It is built in small steps. Every lie that works, every successful manipulation, every moral boundary that is pushed without consequence. And perhaps that is the most disturbing lesson. Danger does not always come from those who are scary. Sometimes it comes from those who know how to imitate normality perfectly.